Let me first of all provide an update about the military situation in Ukraine, which has been developing rapidly again over the last couple of hours. And I'm going to suggest over the course of this video that the conflict in Ukraine and the problems between the United States and China are now becoming interconnected with each other in certain rather concerning ways. Let me first of all start with the big news this morning, which is that over the last couple of hours, there was another massive Russian missile attack on Ukraine. Now, it's extremely difficult to get, again, a full and comprehensive picture of what happens. The Russians do not provide either a figure for the number of missiles launched or the makeup of the missiles launched, but Ukraine says that 81 missiles were launched by the Russians, of which 6 were hypersonic Kinzhal missiles. Now that, by the way, would be a record, as far as I know, of the number of Kinzhal hypersonic missiles used in any individual strike. Of the remaining 75, it's a reasonable guess that these form a mix of KH-101 missiles launched by Russian bombers, to be precise, Tupolev 95 bombers from within Russia, and Kalibr missiles, presumably launched by naval vessels in the Black Sea. Though I can't confirm that, and I'm not absolutely sure whether in fact any Kalibr missiles were launched at all over the course of this strike, but I'm going to assume that they were. There's also evidence, in fact not evidence, there's multiple reports that over the course of the missile strike there was a heavy strike by Geranium-2 drones, and that those were also operating across Ukraine. And it seems that targets all across Ukraine were hit, though, as is becoming increasingly common with these missile strikes, the targets are now becoming more complex, and as the strikes become more complex, the targeting becomes both wider and more varied. The early strikes, the ones that started in October, focused very heavily on Ukraine's energy system, and certainly a part of these strikes, these latest strikes, also seem to have targeted Ukraine's energy system, and we're already getting reports of power blackouts in places like Kiev, in Kharkiv, in other places as well. But I have increasingly come to the view that one of the major targets, one of the major purposes of these strikes is to deplete and run down Ukraine's air defense system. And there was a report, which of course I can't confirm, but which came from a Ukrainian channel, that the Ukrainian authorities have had to reduce the number of S-300 missiles that they launched. They've had to ration the quantity of S-300 missiles they launch against these Russian missile attacks, because the stock of S-300 missiles has now become very seriously depleted. Ukraine is unable to replace this stock. There were reports a couple of days ago that the first Patriot missile battery has arrived from Poland. Presumably, this is the one that was going to be supplied to Ukraine by Germany. It was trundled off to Poland, and the Poles say that they've now supplied it to the Ukrainians. Of course, I can't confirm that, but it's plausible. And there were also reports that the United States has completed training of Ukrainian troops who are going to be using the Patriot missile system, which, by the way, if true, and if it is also true that these Ukrainian personnel only started to receive their training on using the Patriot system a few months ago, when President Biden announced that Patriot missiles would indeed be supplied to Ukraine, assuming, that is to say, that the training did not begin before then, which is possible, then I'm going to say straightforwardly, if that is indeed the case, if it was not the case, if it was the case that training began when the Patriot missile system delivery was announced, then the Ukrainian personnel who are going to be operating this very complex and very difficult missile system are not fully trained to do so. But we'll wait and see what the facts are about that before very long. But anyway, here we see complex missile strike, partly, as I said, directed at the energy system, partly directed at depleting the Ukrainian defenses, the Ukrainian air defenses, and that may not be unconnected to the fact that we're still seeing more visible action by the Russian Air Force, particularly in the area of Avdiivka, which is perhaps one of the most heavily fortified areas of the front line of the Ukrainian defense system, town directly opposite Donetsk city. It's very close to Donetsk city. And the Russians have been dropping gravity bombs from their fighter bombers, apparently Sukhoi 30s and Sukhoi 34s primarily, on Ukrainian defenses in Avdiivka. By the way, a couple of days ago, a Russian Sukhoi 34 jet was shot down over Avdiivka, but Russian reports suggest that this was a friendly fire incident. In other words, it was shot down by apparently the air defenses of the Donbass militia, not by the Ukrainians. Anyway, that's what the Russians have been saying. So the Russians have begun this gravity bombing of Avdiivka. They're starting to sense, I think, that even despite the delivery of this Patriot missile battery, the Ukrainian air defenses are becoming increasingly depleted, and it's becoming safer for them to fly their aircraft and to launch airstrikes with gravity bombs, which is something that they haven't done in the past. And here I'm going to mention one of the people who regularly provides me with updates of things, a person from India. He has discussed in the past how he's one of the people who's explained to me in the past why using gravity bombs would be more effective than artillery strikes in demolishing fortifications. And he's been absolutely right about this. And he also has recently speculated that the Russians would be using FAB 500 bombs, which weigh around 300 kilograms, and which have warheads that carry around 300 kilograms of explosive. And it turns out, once more, that he is absolutely right. That is exactly the bomb that the Russians apparently are using in Avdiivka. So anyway, a complex Russian missile strike, more signs that the Russians are now conducting a bombing campaign on at least one part of the Ukrainian defenses along the front line. I'm going to come to the implications of that fairly soon, by the way. Now, it ought to be said that the other most spectacular aspect of this particular Russian missile strike is the use of these 6 Kinzhal missiles. And that suggests that the Russians have successfully built up a significant stockpile of these missiles. And I wonder what exactly it was that these Kinzhal missiles were used for. And I'm going to make what I think is an educated guess, which is that I suspect that they specifically targeted Ukrainian air defense systems. What apparently has been happening is that the Ukrainians have been, as I said, rationing their use of S-300 missiles. The Russians have their AWACS aircraft, the A-50U mainstay aircraft in Belarus, which gives them information about where the air defense systems are located. They're not just monitoring radars, the Ukrainian radars, when they come on and off, as these missiles home in. They're able to track the launch of the Ukrainian air defense missiles themselves. And I think what the Russians are doing is that as soon as a Ukrainian air defense missile is launched, the MiG-31 fighter jets in Belarus and perhaps the Sukhoi 57 fighter jets, the more advanced 5th generation Sukhoi 57 fighter jets in over Donbass. I'm not absolutely sure that they can carry the Kinzhal, but never mind. But certainly the MiG-31s immediately launch Kinzhal missiles to strike at the air defense launch sites. And they're probably doing so with devastating effect, and they're accelerating the destruction that way of the Ukrainian air defense system. And I anticipate, and I'm guessing, that the Patriot missile system, which apparently is not yet in operation, will be a particular target of these MiG-31s over the next couple of weeks. Anyway, that's, I think, what has happened with this missile strike. So we can see part of what is going on. Still, the Russians attack the energy system. The Ukrainians have to defend it. The Russians may have bigger plans for this energy system eventually. They may be intending at some point to knock it out entirely, perhaps in conjunction with whatever big offensive the Russians eventually launch. More about that soon. But in the meantime, they're depleting the Ukrainian air defense system. They are doing so both by forcing Ukraine to launch missiles to shoot down Russian cruise missiles and uranium drones as these home in. These Russian cruise missiles targeting Ukrainian energy facilities. And when that launch happens, the Russians are able to track the launch, and they're able, at extraordinary speeds, with these hypersonic missiles, to launch counterstrikes on the launch points before the Ukrainians have time to relocate their launchers, the hypersonic missiles, leaving them very little time in order to do that before the hypersonic missile arrives. So that's, I think, what we are seeing. Now, let's talk, however, about information on the front lines. Now, the first thing to say is that there was apparently, over the last few days, a day or so, a Ukrainian attempt to launch some kind of a counterattack near Bakhmut. And the Russians claimed that this attack, this Ukrainian counterattack, was repelled. This is from TASS, Ukrainian troops attempted to counterattack in one of the sections in Artyomovsk called Bakhmut by Ukraine. This is from TASS. But the attack was repelled and the Russian forces are moving forward. Acting head of the Donetsk People's Republic, Denis Pushilin, said on Thursday. The enemy made an attempt to counterattack in one of the sections there, but this attempt failed. Our units are advancing there. And this was all said by Pushilin over the course of an interview with Russia 24 TV, which took place apparently early this morning. And Yevgeny Prigozhin, who's again been very busy and very active and is still complaining about ammunition shortages, has told us that, in fact, another village in the area of Bakhmut has also been captured. And Prigozhin says that the village, this is again from TASS, the village of Dubovo-Vasilievka, northwest of Bakhmut, Artyomovsk, known as Bakhmut in Ukraine, is fully under control of Russian troops. Wagner PMC founder Yevgeny Prigozhin reported on Thursday. Dubovo-Vasilievka is fully under control of the Wagner private military company. Fighting is taking place on the outskirts. The entire village is under our control. Prigozhin's press service quoted him as saying on its Telegram channel. Now, that is a village some distance away from this remaining corridor along which the Ukrainians try to send troops in and out of Bakhmut. And in relation to this, there's been comments now from General Syrsky, who is the commander of the Ukrainian ground forces, and he seems to be committing Ukraine to a further defense of Bakhmut. He says, this is a quotation that I've got from the Slavyangrad channel, but I'm sure that this is correct. The commander of the ground forces of Ukraine, Alexander Syrsky, said that the relevance of holding Bakhmut is constantly growing. Each day of the defense of the city allows us to gain time to prepare reserves and prepare for the upcoming offensive operations. At the same time, in the battles for this fortress, the enemy loses the most prepared and combat-ready part of his troops, the Wagner assault detachments. Now, notice that Syrsky is now saying that the Wagner assault detachments are the best prepared and most combat-ready part of the Russian military active in the war. This is something of a change from what we've been hearing reasonably recently, that the Wagner forces in Bakhmut are basically poorly trained, poorly prepared convicts thrown into the meat grinder by the Russians in order to swamp the Ukrainians in Bakhmut with human wave tactics. Syrsky appears to think that, on the contrary, they're the best part of the Russian military fighting in the war. I'm not saying, by the way, that he's necessarily right, but it's certainly a shift in the explanation, in the description of the Wagner forces coming from the side of Ukraine. Now, there have also been reports that over the last few hours there's been more cases of Ukrainian soldiers fleeing from Bakhmut, and I've now seen reports from the Russian side that they're increasingly doing this without orders from their commanders. And that leads me to think that that destruction of the bridge, which took place a few days ago, was indeed intended to stem an uncontrolled retreat from Bakhmut, and I suspect it's largely succeeded in doing so. Some Ukrainian troops have indeed fled, but they're probably in relatively few numbers. Crossing the fields and using the country lanes is probably exceptionally difficult and dangerous to do. Using the roads, you might be able to get through on the roads if you're very careful and if you're not using vehicles. So that seems to be the purpose of the Ukrainians in blowing up that bridge. They've set up a pontoon bridge there, but presumably they can control it better. And in the meantime, Syrskyi is making it clear that despite the fact that Ukraine has lost control of all of Bakhmut east of the Bakhmutka River, it's determined to go on fighting there, even though the rationale has shifted once more. Now, on that topic, Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, has now said that Bakhmut may eventually fall. And he's quoted as saying, "We cannot rule out that Bakhmut may eventually fall in the coming days." And he said that this won't necessarily, note the word necessarily, be a turning point in the conflict, but he highlights the need to provide urgent assistance, including ammunition, to Ukraine. So despite Syrskyi's assertions that Ukraine must defend Bakhmut, that defending Bakhmut is becoming more important, Stoltenberg appears to think that Ukraine is probably going to lose Bakhmut, perhaps as soon as over the course of the next few days. And there's been a very interesting article in the Financial Times about all of this, and it now openly criticizes Ukrainian tactics in Bakhmut. It says Ukraine's battle of diminishing returns for Bakhmut. Eastern Ukrainian city has become an attritional trap where both sides seek to deplete each other's ranks. Now, can I say this is an article behind a paywall, and for that reason, I'm not going to quote it. I'm not going to quote it in detail. What I will say about it is this. It again makes the very, very bold assumption that the Russians are suffering heavier losses in capturing Bakhmut than the Ukrainians are. It again references that NATO official who said that Russia is losing 5 men in Bakhmut for every 1 Ukrainian who is killed there. I've already made clear my complete disbelief in this for this claim. I don't think that it is true at all, and I repeat my view that I think this NATO official is probably British, and I'm also going to say that I have a shrewd idea who that official might be, but I'm not going to say more because I may very well be wrong and I don't want to name the wrong person. So, to some extent, this article nonetheless, to some extent, appears to stick with the official mantra that the Russians have been suffering heavier losses in Bakhmut than the Ukrainians have. But the article then does say Ukraine is taking heavily losses too, potentially changing the cost-benefit assessment of holding on to the city. And then it goes on to say that Zelensky has raised the stakes, ordering his armed forces to reinforce their positions there and warning that abandoning Bakhmut would leave the Russians an open road to the rest of Donetsk province, which Moscow is determined to seize. And the Financial Times says that this is contrary to Lloyd Austin's comment about a Ukrainian retreat from Bakhmut not being an operational or strategic setback. Interesting, by the way, that Ukrainian retreats would not be, from an American perspective, an operational or strategic setback, even though Russian retreats are always spoken of as if they are. And of course, the Financial Times also quotes Stoltenberg as saying that the loss of Bakhmut would not be a turning point. And the Financial Times says that Ukraine is repeating what it did last year when it depleted Russian forces in the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk fighting, and that this opened the way for a Ukrainian counteroffensive in the autumn. I'm going to say straight away that that is a misrepresentation, in my opinion, of what actually happened in the summer. I think the Ukrainians suffered heavier losses, much heavier losses in the Severodonetsk and Lysychansk fighting than the Russians did. In fact, at one point, as I remember, the Ukrainians were complaining that they were losing 1,000 men killed a day over the course of that fighting. But again, I'm not going to reiterate all of this. But anyway, the article then goes on to say that the question asked by Western officials and experts is, however, whether Ukrainian losses in men and material might hinder its own capacity for a counteroffensive. At the very least, the losses might argue in favour of withdrawal to a new defensive line. And the article then quotes Michael Kaufman, who is a well-known military commentator, very much on the Ukrainian side. Apparently he was born in Ukraine. But I will say something, I find him one of the more interesting military commentators about the war. But anyway, it says that he quotes Kaufman as saying that whilst Ukrainian losses in Bakhmut, their effect on Ukraine's ability to conduct a counteroffensive might be overstated, he nonetheless thinks that the main question is to what extent does defense of Bakhmut represent a strategy with diminishing returns relative to other options. So, there we go. And another paragraph. Some experts worry that Ukraine may be expending high-quality troops and equipment to kill mere Russian prison recruits as cannon fodder, but analysts at the Institute for the Study of War said Wagner was committing some of its elite forces to Bakhmut and that Russian airborne forces had also joined the fight. Anyway, there we go. Criticism from the West about the defense of Bakhmut, the losses Ukraine is suffering. Note that this article reduces everything to a question of attrition and tries to turn the issue of attrition round. So Bakhmut is not a case of Russia inflicting attrition on Bakhmut, which is what Prigozhin has been saying, which is what the Russians have been saying. It is the reverse. It is Ukraine inflicting attrition on the Russians. And we have anonymous Western officials who talk in that way, some commentators who talk in that way. No actual attempt to address the information from the BBC Media Zone analysis, which puts Russian losses over the course of this war at only a fraction of the size that Western commentators are claiming, and no real explanation also of the size of Ukrainian losses. And of course, Zelensky's comment, which was also mirroring a comment made by Shoigu that the fall of Bakhmut would open the way for further Russian advances in Donetsk region, with the Russians able to push forward towards Kramatorsk and Slavyansk and to roll up Ukrainian defences in Donetsk. That's only briefly reported and left unexplored. It's something which I get the sense Western commentators, it's a point that Western commentators are unwilling to address. Let me say straight away that, in my opinion, it is Ukraine which has suffered by far the heaviest attrition in Bakhmut. It's probably true that the Ukrainian troops who have been increasingly fighting in Bakhmut itself are not Ukraine's best forces. But of course, one should not be in too much of a rush to dismiss the effect on Ukrainian morale. And I'm not going to even discuss the humanitarian considerations here of sacrificing the lives of hundreds of men, even if they're lower caliber soldiers, in a battle like Bakhmut. But I have no doubt at all that though the Russian objective in Bakhmut has indeed been to inflict immense attrition on Ukraine, Prigozhin, of course, has said as much, and even though I think the Russians have been largely successful in achieving that, I also think that the Russians do want to capture Bakhmut, and they do see this as this route to advancing upon other parts, other places in Donetsk region. And I think that is the primary reason why Ukraine has defended this town so bitterly, despite the enormous losses it is suffering. Now, there's more and more reports that the Ukrainians are trying to assemble some kind of battle groups to try to relieve the garrison in Bakhmut. I've seen reports that 2 or 3 brigades are being assembled. It seems the ground is becoming increasingly soft. I've discussed the difficulties that might cause Ukraine if they launch such an attack. And of course, they would be advancing into the hail of the Russian artillery. And perhaps not just the Russian artillery, because let me come back to my earlier points about the depletion of the Ukrainian air defense system. It looks as if the Russians are now able to use their air force more aggressively than they have been able to do until recently. They're now starting to use it heavily in the Avdiivka area, and they've been bombing Ukrainian defenses, and they seem to be making significant progress there. And quite possibly, conceivably, before long, they will start doing the same further north in and around Bakhmut. And if Ukrainian forces start trying to push forward in Bakhmut, well, it might not just be artillery, but Russian bombing that is also unleashed against them, and that might be a grim outcome for Ukraine. Having said that, I don't want to preempt what Ukraine might do, and we will just have to wait and see whether Ukraine does launch a counterattack, whether they do regain some ground and perhaps punch a hole through the cauldron around Bakhmut, which is still, by the way, far from sealed, fully sealed. It's not yet, really thick cauldron like the one in Mariupol was. We'll see what the Ukrainians are able to do. But certainly Syrski's comments suggest to me that the Ukrainians are not going to give up on Bakhmut, and that more fighting in and around this town is probably coming. Meanwhile, we also had reports about further Russian advances in the Kremenaya and Kupiansk area, all fairly sketchy, and I've already discussed the situation in Avdiivka, and the Russians have also provided further statements about their defences in Zaporozhye region, which many see as the most likely area of a Ukrainian offensive. And this comes again from TASS, and it quotes Yevgeny Balitsky, who is the head of the Russian-appointed regional government in Zaporozhye region. And Balitsky says this, according to TASS, Russian forces have prepared deeply echeloned defenses in the Zaporozhye region, and the military is ready to repel a potential Ukrainian counteroffensive. We are getting ready for this Ukrainian counteroffensive. We have quite a strong double line of defense. The military has reported that they are ready, he told Rossiya 24 television. Balitsky highlighted, this is from TASS, the role of the administration in defense, for which he said the military was primarily responsible. We monitor supplies for the army and help maintain the supplies, the acting governor specified. According to Balitsky, there were about 40,000 Ukrainian troops near the locality of Prishib in the Kiev-controlled part of the region. And TASS points out that Vladimir Rogov, who is one of Balitsky's deputies, on Monday, that's just 2 days ago, 3 days ago, put the number at less than that, at between 30 to 32,000. So it may be that there's been a faster Ukrainian build-up over the last few days, or it could be that Balitsky and Rogov are counting Ukrainians slightly differently, who's to say? But anyway, one way or the other, there's a significant Ukrainian force in Zaporozhye region, building up in Zaporozhye region. But according to Balitsky, the Russians are ready. And of course, we've seen pictures of these enormous defenses that have been constructed in this area following Surovikin's appointment in September as Russia's overall commander, a role in which he's been superseded since then by General Gerasimov, the chief of the General Staff, but which I suspect in actuality he largely retains. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about the battlefronts.